The summer of 1856 arrived in New Orleans like a fever that refused to break. The air hung thick and wet over St. Charles Avenue, where the grandest mansions stood like white monuments to wealth extracted from cotton, sugar, and human suffering. Among them, the Beaumont estate rose 3 stories high, its Corinthian columns gleaming in the brutal Louisiana sun, its gardens meticulously maintained by hands that were never allowed to rest. Charles Beaumont owned half the cotton trade between New Orleans and Liverpool. His bank held mortgages on plantations from Baton Rouge to Natchez. Men with titles and land begged for audiences with him. But it was his wife, Eleanor, who commanded the true mystery of that house. She had arrived in New Orleans 7 years earlier, a pale beauty from Charleston, with eyes the color of winter storms, and a dowry substantial enough to make even Charles Beaumont take notice. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. The marriage was celebrated as a union of Southern aristocracy and financial power, but those who attended the wedding remembered how Eleanor never smiled during the ceremony, how her hands trembled when she spoke her vows, and how she looked back at the church doors as if expecting someone to stop the proceedings. The Beaumont household ran with mechanical precision. 43 slaves maintained the property, house servants, kitchen staff, stable hands, and field workers who tended the ornamental gardens that were Eleanor's particular obsession. She supervised them personally, appearing each morning in the servants' quarters with a leather-bound ledger, calling out names and assigning tasks with cold efficiency that left no room for error or mercy. But it was the carriage house that occupied the center of every whispered conversation among the staff. The structure sat at the far end of the garden, half hidden by ancient magnolia trees whose branches formed a natural canopy overhead. Built from dark brick that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, it had originally housed the family's coaches and horses, but 3 years into the marriage, Eleanor had the horses moved to new stables and claimed the carriage house as her own private domain. She had it cleaned, furnished with items brought in covered crates from the city, and declared it absolutely off-limits to everyone, including her husband. Charles, preoccupied with his banking empire and his mistress on Rampart Street, seemed content to grant his wife this single eccentricity. After all, wealthy women needed their peculiar hobbies: needlework, watercolors, Bible study circles. If Eleanor wanted a private space for her devotions, what harm could it do? But Eleanor's devotions were anything but ordinary. Every evening at precisely 9 o'clock, after the dinner guests had departed and Charles had retired to his study with brandy and ledgers, Eleanor would dismiss the household staff. All of them were required to return to their quarters behind the main house and remain there until morning, on pain of severe punishment. The only exceptions were 5 individuals who Eleanor summoned by name. Thomas was the first, a man of 40 with iron-grey hair and hands scarred from years of fieldwork before Charles bought him at auction and brought him to the city. He had taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers, a crime that could have cost him his life on any other plantation. Eleanor had discovered this secret within a month of her arrival, and instead of reporting him, had begun leaving books in places where he would find them. Sarah came second. 28 years old, she had been born in the Beaumont household, daughter of the head cook. She moved through the mansion like a ghost, her eyes always downcast, her movements precise and silent. She had lost 2 children to fever before their second birthdays, and something in her had broken that never quite healed. Eleanor had sat with her through both deaths, holding her hand in silence, while the rest of the household pretended grief among slaves was of no consequence. Then came Marcus, barely 19, who had been purchased 6 months earlier from a plantation in Mississippi, where his back had been turned into a map of scars for the crime of defending his sister from the overseer's advances. He could barely speak when he arrived. his voice reduced to a whisper, his eyes holding the kind of terror that never fully fades. Eleanor had personally tended his wounds, applying salves and bandages with hands that never trembled, never showed disgust. Ruth followed, a woman of 60 who had survived the Middle Passage as a child and carried memories of another continent, another life, another name that she whispered sometimes in her sleep. She knew roots and herbs, could predict weather by the flight of birds, and understood sickness in ways that made the white doctors uneasy. Eleanor consulted her often, taking notes in her ledger, asking questions that seemed to have nothing to do with medicine. Finally, there was Benjamin, 12 years old, small for his age, with fingers nimble enough to work the intricate mechanisms of clocks and music boxes. He had been sold away from his mother 2 years earlier, and the separation had left him prone to nightmares that made him cry out in the night. Eleanor had moved him to a room closer to the main house where she could hear him, and more than once the other servants had seen her sitting beside his bed in the darkness, her hand on his shoulder, waiting for the terror to pass. These 5, and only these 5, entered the carriage house with Eleanor Beaumont every night at 9 o'clock. What happened inside became the subject of increasingly wild speculation. The other household slaves traded theories in whispered conversations after their work was done. Josiah, who worked in the stables, claimed he had crept close enough one night to hear singing. Not hymns, but something older, something that made his skin crawl with recognition he couldn't name. Delilah, who did the washing, swore she had seen strange lights through the single window, colors that seemed to shift and pulse like living things. And old Moses, who had served the Beaumont family since Charles was a boy, refused to speak of it at all, crossing himself whenever the carriage house was mentioned and muttering prayers in a language he claimed to have forgotten. The white community of New Orleans had their own suspicions. At dinner parties and afternoon teas, the wives of planters and merchants discussed Eleanor Beaumont with a mixture of envy and unease. Her beauty was undeniable, her manners impeccable, her taste in fashion months ahead of everyone else. But there was something about her that didn't quite fit. She never gossiped, she showed no interest in the social hierarchies that governed their world. When conversation turned to the management of slaves, the beatings, the brandings, the casual cruelties that were considered necessary for maintaining order, Eleanor would excuse herself, her face pale, her hands gripping her fan until her knuckles showed white. "She's too soft with them," Mrs. Lavinia Ashford declared over cards one afternoon. "I've seen how she speaks to her people, as if they were, well, as if they had feelings that mattered. It's unseemly. Dangerous even. They get ideas. I heard she actually nurses them when they're sick," another woman added, her voice dripping with scandal. "Touches them with her own hands. No proper lady would—" "Perhaps she's barren," Mrs. Ashford interrupted, her tone suggesting this explained everything. 7 years of marriage and no children. It does something to a woman's mind, that kind of failure. She probably treats those slaves like the babies she can't have. But the truth was far stranger than any of them imagined. Inside the carriage house, Eleanor Beaumont was conducting an experiment that would have seen her committed to an asylum if discovered, or worse, tried for sedition and hanged. The brick walls concealed something that violated every law and custom of Louisiana society, something that made her both criminal and heretic in the eyes of everyone she knew. She was teaching them their freedom. Not just literacy, though, that alone was a capital offense. She was teaching them mathematics so they could calculate the value of their own labor, the profits extracted from their bodies. She taught them geography so they could understand the distances to free states, the routes that others had taken to escape. She taught them history, not the sanitized version presented in southern schools, but the real history of slave rebellions, of Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, of Denmark Vesey in Charleston, of Nat Turner in Virginia. Every night for 3 hours, Eleanor Beaumont transformed from the cold, elegant wife of a banker into something far more dangerous, a teacher of revolution. The arrangement had begun almost by accident, born from Eleanor's own suffocating desperation and a single moment of reckless honesty. She had found Thomas in the library one morning before dawn, standing frozen before the bookshelves with a volume of Frederick Douglass's narrative in his hands. A book that shouldn't have existed in that house, a book Eleanor herself had smuggled in from a contact in the north. He hadn't heard her enter, and for a long moment she watched him devour the pages with his eyes, his lips moving silently, his entire body trembling with the force of recognition. When he finally sensed her presence, the book fell from his hands as if it had burned him. He dropped to his knees immediately, his head bowed, waiting for the inevitable punishment. Reading was forbidden. Possessing abolitionist literature was treason. The fact that he had found her secret cache proved he was intelligent, resourceful, and dangerous. Exactly the kind of slave that haunted the nightmares of every white Southerner. Eleanor had bent down, picked up the book, and asked the question that would change both their lives forever. What do you think of Douglass's argument about the psychological effects of slavery on the enslaved? Thomas had looked up at her with tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. His hands shook violently. He understood the trap he was in. If he admitted he could read, he confessed to a crime. If he pretended ignorance, he insulted her intelligence. Eleanor made the decision for him. Meet me in the Carriage house tonight at 9 o'clock. Bring no one. Tell no one. What I'm about to offer you is dangerous for both of us, but I think we're both past the point of caring about safety. Aren't we, Thomas? She had expected him to refuse, to run, to report her to Charles as a matter of self-preservation, but Thomas had simply stared at her, and she saw in his eyes something she recognized from her own mirror, absolute desperation masquerading as composure. Yes, Miss Eleanor, he whispered, I think we are. That first night, she waited in the Carriage house with her heart hammering against her ribs, convinced he wouldn't come, half hoping he wouldn't, because it would spare them both from the consequences of what she was proposing. But at 9 o'clock exactly, Thomas appeared in the doorway like a shadow made solid. They sat in silence for 5 full minutes before Eleanor found her voice. I'm going to be honest with you, Thomas, in a way that could get us both killed. I hate everything about this life. I hate this house, this city, this entire obscene civilization built on torture and theft. I married Charles because my father was drowning in debt and needed the alliance. I came here thinking I could endure it by keeping my head down and my mouth shut, but I can't anymore. I'm suffocating. And teaching you, teaching all of you who want to learn, is the only thing that makes me feel human. Do you understand? Thomas had studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I understand, he said finally. But Miss Eleanor, you need to know what you're really offering me. It's not just education, it's hope. And hope is the most dangerous thing you can give a slave, because once I have it, I won't be able to live without it. I'll start thinking about freedom like it's something I deserve instead of something impossible. I'll start seeing my chains, even when I used to be able to ignore them. You're not saving me. You're destroying whatever peace I've managed to make with my situation. Are you prepared for that? Eleanor felt the full weight of his words settle over her, like a death sentence. He was right. She was being selfish, salving her own conscience at his expense. But she also knew that turning back was impossible now. She had already crossed too many lines. Then we'll be destroyed together, she said quietly, and maybe that's better than continuing to pretend we're something we're not. Thomas nodded slowly. Then teach me everything. And so it began. For the first month, the Carriage house belonged only to Eleanor and Thomas. She brought him books smuggled from abolitionist networks in the North, volumes by Douglass, Garrison, Harriet Beecher Stowe, William Lloyd Garrison. She taught him proper grammar, formal rhetoric, political philosophy. They read the Constitution together, and Thomas laughed bitterly when they reached the parts about all men being created equal. Did Jefferson own slaves when he wrote that? Thomas asked. Over 600 throughout his lifetime, Eleanor answered. He even fathered children with one of them, Sally Hemings. The hypocrisy is baked into the foundation of this country. Then the foundation is rotten, Thomas said, and everything built on it is rotten too. Eleanor didn't argue. She couldn't. But Thomas absorbed everything with a hunger that was almost frightening. He filled slate after slate with notes, memorized entire speeches, began writing his own essays, analyzing the economics of slavery and the moral bankruptcy of Southern Christianity. His intelligence was formidable, and Eleanor found herself wondering what he might have become in a just world. A professor, a lawyer, a politician. Instead, he was property valued at $1,200. It was Thomas who suggested expanding their dangerous school. Sarah needs this, he said one night. I've watched her for 3 years now, Miss Eleanor. She's dying inside. Those babies she lost broke something that won't heal on its own. If we could give her something to hope for, something to believe matters beyond just surviving until tomorrow. Eleanor hesitated. Every additional person multiplied the risk exponentially. But she had also seen Sarah's hollow eyes, had recognized in her the kind of grief that turns inward and becomes poison. So she took the chance. Sarah arrived at the Carriage house terrified and confused, convinced she was being summoned for some punishment she couldn't identify. When Eleanor explained what was really happening, Sarah simply stared in disbelief. You want to teach me to read? Her voice was barely audible. Why? What difference does it make? My babies are dead. I'm dead. I'm just waiting for my body to figure it out. Eleanor reached across the table and took Sarah's hands in her own, feeling the calluses, the burn scars from years of kitchen work. Your babies mattered, Eleanor said fiercely. Your grief matters. You matter. And someday someone needs to bear witness to what happened here. Someone needs to survive and tell the truth about what this system did to people like you. That's not nothing, Sarah. That's everything. Sarah's face crumpled then, and she sobbed with a rawness that seemed to tear open the very air in the room. Eleanor held her. This woman who was legally her property and felt the full obscenity of that fact burn through her like acid. When Sarah finally lifted her head, her eyes were different. Still haunted, but no longer empty. Teach me, she whispered. Marcus came next, then Ruth, and finally Benjamin. Each recruitment was deliberate, careful, based on Eleanor's assessment of who could be trusted and who needed this education most desperately. And each brought something unique to their secret school. Marcus, despite the trauma that had reduced his voice to a whisper, possessed a mathematical mind that stunned Eleanor. He could solve complex equations mentally, could see patterns in numbers that she had to work through carefully on paper. She gave him books on engineering and architecture and watched his face transform as he studied blueprints and structural calculations. I could build things, he said one night, his voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. Real things, buildings that would last. If I was free, I could build things that mattered. You will, Eleanor told him. Though she had no idea if it was true, Ruth brought knowledge that existed outside of books entirely. She shared African medical practices, herbal remedies that actually worked, agricultural techniques that improved soil quality. She told stories passed down through generations, preserved orally across the Middle Passage. Eleanor took notes furiously, recognizing she was being given access to an entire intellectual tradition that white society dismissed as primitive superstition. Your people don't know half of what you think you know, Ruth said one night, mixing a poultice that would later heal an infection the white doctor had declared fatal. You have books, we have memory. Both are knowledge, both are power. And Benjamin, young as he was, possessed a curiosity that knew no boundaries. He wanted to understand everything: physics, astronomy, biology, chemistry. Eleanor found herself researching topics she'd never considered just to keep pace with his questions. Why is the sky blue? He asked. Light scattering, Eleanor explained, showing him the relevant passages in a natural philosophy text. Why does light scatter? The properties of the atmosphere and the wavelength of light. What's a wavelength? The distance between peaks in a wave of energy. What's energy? Eleanor laughed despite herself. That, Benjamin, is a question people smarter than me are still trying to answer. The Carriage house became a space unlike anywhere else in New Orleans. For 3 hours every night, the fundamental lie of slavery dissolved. 5 people treated as property became scholars, teachers, debaters, friends. They argued about philosophy and politics, analyzed poetry, discussed strategy for the growing abolitionist movement in the North. Eleanor brought them newspapers with reports from Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces were fighting a small civil war that everyone knew was a preview of something larger coming. "It's going to be a real war soon," Thomas said one night, studying a map of the United States. "The South won't give this up peacefully. There's too much money at stake, too much power, too much psychological investment in believing they're superior." "How long?" Marcus asked. 5 years. Maybe less. Lincoln might win in 1860, and that'll be the trigger. South Carolina will secede first. "How do you know?" Benjamin asked. Thomas smiled grimly. "Because I've been reading their newspapers too. They're not even hiding it anymore. They're openly discussing secession, talking about it like it's inevitable, like it's their right." "When the war comes," Sarah said quietly, "what happens to us?" The question hung in the air. They all knew the answer. War would make their situation even more dangerous. Slaveholders would be paranoid about rebellion, about slaves taking advantage of the chaos. Punishments would become more severe, surveillance more intense. "We survive," Ruth said firmly, "like we've always survived. We endure what we have to endure, and we wait for our moment." But Eleanor knew time was running out faster than any of them wanted to admit. Charles had started asking questions. At first they were casual inquiries. What did she do in the Carriage house for so long every night? Why did she need those specific 5 servants? Why the secrecy? Eleanor deflected with practiced ease, playing the role of the pious, slightly eccentric wife, engaged in elaborate religious rituals. But Charles was getting suspicious. She could see it in how he watched her at breakfast, how he questioned the household staff about her activities, how he had started coming home from the bank earlier, as if hoping to catch her in some revealing mistake. Then one morning, Eleanor found him in her private study, holding her coded ledger, the one where she tracked lessons, planned curriculum, noted each student's progress. "What is this?" Charles asked, his voice dangerously calm. Eleanor's blood turned to ice, but she kept her face composed. Household accounts, tracking expenses for the garden, supplies for the kitchen, that sort of thing. "Really?" Charles flipped through the pages. "Because these numbers don't make sense as household expenses. They're too systematic, too deliberate. What do these notations mean, Eleanor? T, progressing in advanced rhetoric. S, showing aptitude for historical analysis. M, excelling in mathematics." "What are you tracking?" Eleanor realized her mistake too late. She had gotten careless, too confident in her coding system. Now Charles was holding evidence that could destroy everything. "They're prayer groups," she said, grasping for any explanation. "I've organized the servants into study groups for scripture memorization. The notations track their progress." Charles stared at her for a long, terrible moment. Then he closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "Eleanor, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Are you teaching the slaves to read?" The silence stretched between them like a blade. Eleanor knew that lying was pointless now. Charles wasn't stupid. He had seen through her excuses. The only question was what he would do with the information. "Yes," she said finally, "I am." Charles's face went pale, then red. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the legal consequences, the social consequences? If this becomes public, I'll be ruined. The bank will collapse. We'll both be arrested. Those 5 slaves will be executed. Is that what you want? I want, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her, to be able to look at myself in the mirror without feeling like I'm complicit in atrocity. That's what I want, Charles. Complicit? Charles's laugh was bitter. We're not complicit, Eleanor. We benefit. There's a difference. This entire civilization runs on slavery. The banks, the cotton trade, the railroads, the factories in the north that process southern cotton, all of it depends on the system you're so eager to undermine. You think teaching 5 slaves to read makes you noble? It makes you a fool. Perhaps, Eleanor said quietly, but it makes me a fool who can sleep at night. Charles studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. Not anger anymore, but calculation. I could report you, he said slowly. I should report you, but it would destroy me too, and I've worked too hard to build what I have. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop immediately tonight. You're going to tell those 5 slaves that the lessons are over, and you're going to make it clear that if any of them speak about what happened, they'll be sold to the worst plantation in Louisiana. Do you understand? Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. And if I refuse? Then I'll sell all 5 of them tomorrow morning to a slave trader who specializes in the Deep South cotton plantations. Places where life expectancy is measured in years, not decades. Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth, Benjamin, all of them will be gone by noon. Is that what you want? Eleanor felt the trap close around her. Charles had found the one threat that would work. He couldn't force her to stop caring, but he could threaten the people she cared about. He could use her love as a weapon. I'll stop, she whispered, the words tasting like poison. Good. And Eleanor, if I ever find evidence that you've resumed these lessons, I won't give you a warning. They'll just disappear. Do we understand each other? Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Charles left, taking the ledger with him. Eleanor stood alone in her study, shaking with rage and grief and helplessness. She had known this moment would come eventually. She had known that the weight of the world they lived in would crush any attempt at resistance. But knowing it intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were different things entirely. That night she had to tell them. She had to walk into the carriage house and look into 5 faces full of hope and trust, and explain that it was over, that Charles knew, that they were out of time. The walk from the main house to the carriage house felt like a death march. Eleanor's hands shook as she lit the lamps, as she arranged the chairs in their familiar circle, as she waited for the 5 people who had become more than students, who had become the only genuine friends she had in this city built on lies. They arrived one by one, sensing immediately that something was wrong. Thomas entered first, his expression already guarded. Sarah followed, wringing her hands. Marcus, Ruth, and Benjamin came last, the boy looking small and frightened in the lamplight. We need to talk, Eleanor said, and even she could hear the grief in her voice. Thomas sat down slowly. He found out. It wasn't a question. Eleanor nodded. How much does he know? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Everything. He found my records. He knows I've been teaching you. He knows about the books, the lessons, all of it. Eleanor forced herself to meet their eyes. He's given me an ultimatum. Either we stop immediately, or he sells all 5 of you to the worst plantations he can find. Tomorrow, the silence that followed was suffocating. Benjamin started to cry quietly. Ruth reached over and took his hand, her face carved from stone. Marcus stared at the floor, his shoulders rigid. Sarah simply closed her eyes, as if she could will herself into not existing. It was Thomas who finally spoke. So this is it then. 3 months of freedom, and now we go back to being property. To pretending we don't know what we know, to bowing and scraping and saying, "Yes, master," while dying inside. I'm so sorry, Eleanor whispered. I should never have started this. I was selfish. I was trying to save myself, and instead, I've just made everything worse for all of you. No, Ruth's voice cut through the room like a blade. Don't you dare apologize for treating us like human beings. Don't you dare regret giving us these months. Yes, it hurts now. Yes, it's going to hurt every day for the rest of our lives, knowing what we're missing, but it was still worth it. Was it? Marcus's voice was raw. Because I don't know if I can go back. I don't know if I can stand in that stable and brush horses and pretend I'm not worth more than them. I don't know if I can survive knowing what I know now. You will, Ruth said firmly, because you have to, because giving up is what they want. They want us broken. They want us to believe we're nothing. And every day we survive, every day we remember what Miss Eleanor taught us, we prove them wrong. But for how long? Sarah asked. How long do we just survive? How long do we wait for something to change? Until it changes, Thomas said. The war is coming. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year, but it's coming. And when it does, we need to be ready. Eleanor listened to them talk, watched them process the end of their fragile dream, and felt something crack open inside her chest. They were stronger than she was. They had endured things that would have destroyed her, and they were still finding reasons to hope, still planning for a future that might never come. There's something else, Eleanor said quietly. I need you to understand the full danger you're in. Charles might be watching now. He might be looking for any excuse to follow through on his threat. So you have to be careful, more careful than ever. If anyone suspects that you can read, if anyone notices anything different about you, we know, Thomas interrupted. We've been pretending our whole lives, Miss Eleanor. We know how to hide. But it's different now, Eleanor insisted. Before, you were hiding something you taught yourselves. Now you're hiding knowledge that came from me. If Charles decides you're a liability, if he thinks selling you would be easier than managing the risk, then we die knowing more than we would have otherwise, Marcus said simply. We die knowing we were worth teaching. That's more than most of us get. Eleanor wanted to argue, to find some way to protect them, to undo the danger she had placed them in. But she knew there was nothing she could do. They were right. This was the world they lived in. This was the reality they had to navigate. I wish, she said, her voice breaking, that I could do more. I wish I could free you, all of you, but I can't. Charles controls everything. The bank, the property, the assets. I don't have money of my own. I don't have legal standing to manumit anyone. I'm as trapped as you are, just in a different way. We know, Sarah said gently. You've done what you could. That's more than anyone else has done. They sat together in silence for a long time, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Thomas stood up. We should go, he said, before someone notices we've been here too long. One by one they filed toward the door. Benjamin paused and looked back at Eleanor, his young face ancient with grief. Thank you, Miss Eleanor, he whispered, for everything. Then they were gone, disappearing into the humid New Orleans night, back to their quarters, back to their chains, back to the lie they would have to live for the rest of their lives. Eleanor remained in the carriage house long after they left, surrounded by the books that had briefly offered them freedom, knowing she would have to pack them away, hide the evidence, pretend this space had only ever been used for innocent prayer. She thought about burning the books. It would be safer, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. So instead, she hid them in a false panel she had installed in the wall, sealed them away like secrets, like hope, preserved in amber. When she finally returned to the main house, Charles was waiting in her bedroom. It's done, he asked. It's done. Good. Now we can go back to normal, to the way things should be. But Eleanor knew nothing would ever be normal again. The next 3 weeks passed in a grey fog of routine. Eleanor went through the motions of her life, supervising the household, attending church, hosting dinner parties where she smiled and nodded and said nothing of substance. She saw Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth and Benjamin every day in their various roles around the estate, but they never spoke beyond the formal exchanges required by their positions. Thomas pruned the roses, Sarah served tea, Marcus groomed the horses. Ruth prepared herbal remedies in the kitchen. Benjamin repaired the grandfather clock in the foyer. They were perfect slaves, obedient, invisible, unremarkable. But Eleanor caught Thomas watching her sometimes, with eyes full of questions he couldn't ask. She saw Sarah's hands shake when she poured water, as if the weight of everything unsaid was too heavy to carry. Marcus had stopped whispering entirely, his trauma-induced silence complete. Ruth moved through the house like a ghost, her ancient knowledge locked away again. And Benjamin had started having nightmares again, his small voice crying out in the night for his mother, for freedom, for things he had tasted and lost. Eleanor wanted to comfort them, to find some way to continue what they had started. But Charles was watching. She could feel his eyes on her constantly, monitoring her interactions with the staff, looking for any sign that she was defying him. So she did nothing, and the nothing ate at her like acid. Then Charles got sick. It started with a headache, just a persistent pain behind his eyes that he dismissed as stress from the bank. But over the course of a week, the headache intensified. He became sensitive to light, retreating to his darkened study with the curtains drawn. His hands began to shake. He complained of seeing shadows that weren't there, of hearing whispers in empty rooms. The doctors came, 3 of them, the most respected physicians in New Orleans. They examined Charles, prescribed laudanum for the pain, and recommended rest. But he only got worse. His vision started to fail. First peripheral darkness, then spreading blindness that left him fumbling in shadows even at noon. His legs weakened until he needed help to walk, and the trembling that had started in his hands spread through his entire body, violent shaking fits that left him exhausted and terrified. "What's happening to me?" he demanded, clutching Eleanor's arm with fingers that felt like claws. "What is this?" The doctors had no answers. They tested his blood, examined his eyes, consulted medical texts. Some suggested poisoning, but could find no source. Others thought it might be a tumor in the brain, but had no way to confirm or treat it. One physician quietly suggested syphilis, earned from Charles's frequent visits to his mulatto mistress on Rampart Street, but the symptoms didn't quite match. As Charles deteriorated, rumors spread through New Orleans like fever. At first, the talk was sympathetic. Poor Charles Beaumont, struck down in his prime by mysterious illness. But sympathy quickly curdled into something darker. A clerk at Charles's bank reported seeing Eleanor burning documents in the garden late one night. Papers from Charles's private safe, account books, correspondence. The clerk swore she was destroying evidence of something, though evidence of what he couldn't say. Then Father Benedict from St. Louis Cathedral let slip during a private dinner that Eleanor had come to him requesting absolution for an unnamed sin. She'd offered a substantial donation to the church, $10,000, in exchange for his silence and prayers. Father Benedict had refused the money but accepted her confession, which meant he was bound by priest-penitent privilege to never reveal what she had told him. But the fact that Eleanor had sought absolution at all was damning enough. The wives of New Orleans society descended on the scandal like vultures. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford hosted a tea specifically to discuss Eleanor's suspicious behavior. "I've always said there was something wrong with that woman," Mrs. Ashford declared, her voice dripping with vindication. "The way she coddles her slaves, the secrecy, those strange nightly rituals in the Carriage house, and now her husband is dying of a mysterious illness. It's obvious what's happening." "Poison?" another woman suggested, her eyes bright with malicious excitement. "Or witchcraft," Mrs. Ashford said seriously. "I've heard she consults with that old African woman, Ruth. Everyone knows those people practice dark arts they brought from Africa. Curses and hexes and God knows what else. Eleanor probably paid her to put a curse on Charles. But why? Someone asked. What would she gain? Freedom, Mrs. Ashford said simply. Eleanor would inherit everything if Charles dies. The house, the bank, the assets. She'd be one of the wealthiest widows in Louisiana, rich enough to do whatever she wants, live however she wants, maybe even move north where she'd fit in better with all those abolition-loving Yankees. The rumors multiplied and mutated. Some said Eleanor had been having an affair with one of the slaves. Thomas was the most common subject of this particularly scandalous theory. Others claimed she had gone mad, that the childlessness had broken her mind, and now she was acting out some deranged fantasy. A few whispered that Charles's illness was divine punishment for some unspecified sin, and Eleanor's strange behavior was her attempt to atone. But the most persistent rumor was the simplest. Eleanor had poisoned her husband, slowly and deliberately, and was now destroying evidence and buying silence to cover her crime. The police came to interview her. Not formally, not yet, but Detective Augustin Mercier from the city constabulary appeared one afternoon with questions he framed as concern. "Mrs. Beaumont, I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. But given your husband's condition, we've received some inquiries about the household. Nothing official, you understand, just neighbors being concerned. Eleanor received him in the parlor, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her face a mask of aristocratic composure. Of course, Detective. How can I help? Well, ma'am, there are some questions about your activities, specifically the burning of documents. One of your husband's clerks reported seeing you destroy what appeared to be bank records. Can you explain that?" "I was burning my personal correspondence," Eleanor said smoothly. "Letters from friends, old invitations, that sort of thing. I periodically clean out my study. There's nothing sinister about it." "And the large payment you offered to Father Benedict?" Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I made a donation to the church, as many wealthy Catholics do. Father Benedict felt the amount was inappropriate and declined. I respect his decision. Is there a crime in being charitable?" Detective Mercier studied her carefully. "No crime at all, Mrs. Beaumont. But you can understand how these things look, given the circumstances. Your husband is dying of an unknown illness. You're destroying documents, offering large sums of money to clergy. It creates a certain impression." "Detective, my husband is dying. I'm devastated. I'm also trying to manage his affairs, protect his legacy, and maintain my faith during this terrible time. If people want to interpret my grief as guilt, I can't stop them. But I can assure you I have done nothing wrong." Mercier nodded slowly. "I'm sure that's true, Mrs. Beaumont. But I would recommend being careful about appearances. New Orleans society can be unforgiving when it comes to scandal." After he left, Eleanor sat alone in the parlor, her hands finally shaking now that no one could see. She knew what was happening. The city was turning against her, building a narrative that would end with her arrest, trial, and execution. And she had no way to prove her innocence, because the truth was almost as damning as the lies. She hadn't poisoned Charles, but she had defied him. She had broken the law. She had taught slaves to read and given them ideas that threatened the entire social order. In some ways, she was guilty of everything they suspected, just not in the way they imagined. That night, Eleanor went to the Carriage house for the first time in 3 weeks. She needed to think. She needed to be in the space where she had briefly felt like she was doing something right, something good, even if it had all fallen apart. The building was dark and silent. She lit a lamp and sat in her usual chair, surrounded by the ghosts of lessons past. That's when she noticed the marks on the walls. They had been made with charcoal, scratched and drawn in places where the lamplight barely reached. Faces. 5 faces, rendered in rough but recognizable detail. Thomas with his iron-grey hair, Sarah with her hollow eyes, Marcus with his youth and scars, Ruth with her ancient wisdom, Benjamin with his heartbreaking innocence, and beneath each face, a name, written over and over again in increasingly desperate handwriting, as if whoever had made these marks was trying to preserve something that was slipping away. Thomas, 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 Sarah, 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 Marcus, 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 Ruth, 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 Benjamin, Benjamin, Benjamin. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Someone had been here. Someone had been coming to this place and creating... What? A memorial? A warning? A prayer? She moved around the room, following the marks. They covered every wall, hidden in shadows, visible only when you knew to look, and mixed among the names and faces were symbols, African symbols that Ruth had taught them, mathematical equations that Marcus had solved, lines of poetry that Thomas had memorized, botanical drawings that Sarah had learned to identify, clockwork diagrams that Benjamin had studied. It was a record, a hidden history of everything they had learned, everything they had been, everything they were trying not to forget. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. They had taken such a terrible risk, coming here when it was forbidden, leaving evidence that could get them all killed. But they had done it anyway, because forgetting was a kind of death too, because maintaining hope required having something tangible to hold on to. She was so absorbed in studying the marks that she didn't hear the footsteps behind her until it was too late. "I knew you'd come back here eventually." Eleanor spun around to find Charles standing in the doorway, supported by a cane, his blind eyes somehow still managing to find her in the darkness. His face was gaunt, his hands trembling violently, but his voice was clear. "Charles, you shouldn't be out of bed." "Don't," he interrupted. "Don't pretend to care about my health. We both know what's happening here." Eleanor's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean." Charles laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You poisoned me, Eleanor. You've been poisoning me for months. Slowly, carefully, probably with something Ruth provided, some African root or herb that Western medicine can't detect. You're killing me to gain control of my fortune and free your precious students." "That's not true," Eleanor said, but even she could hear the doubt in her voice, because while she hadn't poisoned him, while she knew she was innocent of that specific crime, she had wished him dead 1,000 times. She had fantasized about his death, about the freedom it would bring, and if thoughts could kill, Charles would have died long ago. "Isn't it?" Charles moved deeper into the carriage house, his cane tapping against the floor. "Let me tell you what I think happened. I think when I told you to stop teaching them, you decided I was the problem. I was the obstacle between you and your little crusade. So you decided to remove me. You went to Ruth, who knows poisons better than any doctor in Louisiana. She gave you something subtle, something that would look like natural illness, and you've been administering it to me ever since." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I would never." "Why not?" Charles demanded, his voice rising. "You've already broken every other law. You've committed sedition, harbored fugitive thoughts, corrupted valuable property. Why wouldn't you commit murder too? What's one more crime when you're already damned?" Eleanor stared at him, this man she had married 7 years ago, this man who had never loved her, never seen her as anything more than a decorative acquisition. And she realized with cold certainty that it didn't matter what she said. He had already decided she was guilty. The city had decided she was guilty. And in a system where women had no legal standing, where slaves had no voice, where power flowed only one direction, the truth was irrelevant. "If you believe I'm guilty," Eleanor said quietly, "then report me to the police. Have me arrested. Let them search the house, test my belongings, question the servants. But we both know you won't do that, because a trial would expose everything, your neglect, your mistress, your complicity in my crimes. You'd rather die quietly than face that scandal." Charles smiled, a terrible expression on his wasted face. "You're right. I don't want a trial. That's why I came here tonight, to give you a choice." "What choice?" "Run." Charles gestured weakly around the carriage house. "Take whatever you need and disappear. Tonight. I'll tell everyone you fled because you were guilty. My death will be blamed on you, but you'll be gone, free. Isn't that what you wanted?" Eleanor felt the trap closing. And the 5 of them? Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth, Benjamin? Stay property, stay here, die here eventually, like all slaves do. You don't get to save them, Eleanor. You only get to save yourself. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Eleanor looked at the marks on the walls, at the names written over and over, at the evidence of 5 people desperately trying to hold on to their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. "What if I don't run?" she asked. "Then you hang," Charles said simply. "I'll make sure of it. I'll testify that you confessed to poisoning me, that you bragged about it. They'll believe me. I'm a respected banker. You're just a woman with suspicious habits and dangerous ideas. Who do you think they'll believe?" Eleanor understood then. She was being exiled, expelled from the system she had tried to resist, pushed out into some undefined space where she could neither help nor harm. Charles was offering her life in exchange for abandoning everything she had fought for. "I need time," she said finally, "to think." "You have until dawn," Charles said. "After that, I go to the police. Decide quickly, Eleanor. Your life or your principles. Most people find that's an easy choice." He left her then, tapping his way back toward the main house, leaving Eleanor alone with the faces on the wall and an impossible decision. Eleanor remained in the carriage house until the candle burned low and shadows consumed the charcoal faces on the walls. She traced each name with her fingers: Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth, Benjamin, feeling the desperate pressure of whoever had carved these letters into the brick. They had risked everything to leave this record, to insist that what they had learned mattered, that who they had become mattered. And now Charles was asking her to abandon them. No, not asking, commanding. "Run or hang. Save yourself or die with your principles," as if those were the only 2 options. As if resistance could only exist in grand gestures or complete surrender. But Eleanor had spent 7 years in New Orleans, learning that resistance came in smaller forms too. In Sarah, continuing to wake up each morning despite crushing grief. In Marcus's whispered words gradually returning. In Ruth's preservation of knowledge that predated slavery itself. In Benjamin's refusal to stop asking questions, even when questions were dangerous. In Thomas, teaching himself to read when reading could cost him his life. They had survived by being patient, by hiding, by waiting for moments of opportunity, by understanding that sometimes survival itself was an act of rebellion. Eleanor could run. She could take Charles's offer, disappear north, reinvent herself in Boston or New York or some other city where her past wouldn't follow. She had contacts among the abolition societies, money hidden away, skills that could earn her a living. She could survive, but survival without purpose was just slow death by another name. She thought about Charles's illness, the headaches, the blindness, the trembling. The doctors mystified, unable to diagnose or treat, everyone assuming poison because what else could cause such specific progressive symptoms, except Eleanor knew she hadn't poisoned him. Which meant either Charles was dying of natural causes with spectacularly unfortunate timing, or someone else was responsible, Ruth. The thought arrived fully formed, and Eleanor immediately tried to dismiss it. Ruth wouldn't. She was too careful, too aware of the consequences. Poisoning Charles would endanger everyone in the household, would bring down investigations and suspicions that could destroy them all. Unless Ruth had decided the risk was worth it. Eleanor remembered their last lesson, the conversation about waiting for the right moment. Thomas talking about the coming war, Ruth saying, "We survive until we don't have to anymore." Marcus asking how long they had to just endure. What if Ruth had decided the moment was now? What if she had chosen action over endless patient suffering? Eleanor needed to know, not to stop it. Charles's death would solve multiple problems. But to understand. To know if she was complicit through ignorance, or if she could still pretend innocence. She left the carriage house and moved through the dark garden toward the kitchen dependency where Ruth kept her herbs and remedies. The building was locked, but Eleanor had keys to everything on the property. Inside, bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, casting strange shadows in the moonlight filtering through the window. Jars lined the shelves, each carefully labeled in Ruth's neat handwriting. Eleanor lit a lamp and began searching. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. Her knowledge of poisons was theoretical, learned from books rather than practical application. But Ruth had taught her some things during their lessons. Which plants caused paralysis, which disrupted the nervous system, which accumulated slowly in the body over time. She found it in a jar marked headache relief, a powder that looked innocuous, but which Eleanor recognized from her reading. Oleander mixed with something else, maybe foxglove, both cardiac toxins, both capable of causing the exact symptoms Charles displayed when administered in small doses over weeks. Eleanor stood holding the jar, understanding flooding through her. Ruth had been poisoning Charles, slowly, carefully, using Eleanor's own position to deliver the doses. Those herbal teas Eleanor had been bringing Charles for his headaches, laced with poison. The tonic Ruth had prepared for his weakness, more poison. Every remedy designed to help had actually been killing him by degrees, and Eleanor had been the unwitting delivery system. She should have been angry, should have felt betrayed, but instead she felt a strange sense of relief. Because if Ruth had done this, it meant Eleanor wasn't as alone as she thought. It meant someone else had decided to fight back, had chosen action over acceptance, had refused to wait patiently for history to run its course. Eleanor returned to the main house carrying the jar. She found Charles in his study, slumped in his chair, his breathing labored. He stirred when she entered. "Eleanor." His blind eyes searched the darkness. "Have you decided?" "I have questions first," Eleanor said, settling into the chair across from him. "About your illness." "What about it?" "The doctors can't diagnose it. The symptoms are unusual, progressive, almost as if something is accumulating in your system over time." Charles was silent for a moment. "You think I'm being poisoned?" "I know you are." Eleanor placed the jar on the desk between them. "Oleander and foxglove, cardiac toxins. Ruth has been putting them in the remedies I've been bringing you. Small doses, carefully calibrated. Enough to cause symptoms, but not enough to kill quickly. You've been dying for months, Charles. Just very, very slowly." She expected denial, anger, fear. Instead, Charles laughed, that same terrible sound like breaking glass. "I know," he said simply. Eleanor felt the room tilt. "What?" "I've known for 6 weeks, since the first time my vision started to blur. I may not be a doctor, but I'm not stupid. I recognized what was happening, and when I searched Ruth's supplies, I found the same jar you're holding now." "Then why didn't you stop her?" Eleanor demanded. "Why didn't you have her arrested? Executed?" Charles leaned back in his chair, his face gaunt in the lamplight. "Because she was doing me a favor." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. "I'm dying anyway," Charles continued, his voice matter-of-fact. "The doctors don't know it yet, but I do. There's something wrong with my blood. I've been seeing specialists in secret for over a year. They call it a disease of the blood itself. The cells multiplying out of control, choking out everything healthy. It's fatal, progressive, painful. I have maybe 6 months left, maybe less." "You're dying of natural causes," Eleanor whispered. "And you let everyone think I was poisoning you." "Yes, because it gave me leverage. If I'm being murdered, you're the obvious suspect. Your suspicious behavior, your dangerous ideas, your clear unhappiness with our marriage. It all points to you. And that means I can use your guilt, real or perceived, to control the situation." Eleanor felt rage building in her chest. "You're using your own death as a weapon." "I'm using what I have," Charles corrected. "I'm dying, Eleanor, My bank is drowning in bad loans to planters who can't pay because cotton prices are falling. My mistress is pregnant and blackmailing me. My reputation is crumbling. Everything I built is collapsing. But I can still control how I'm remembered. And I can still control you by letting me hang for a murder I didn't commit. Unless you run, which you will, because you're not actually brave enough to die for your principles. You'll run north, reinvent yourself, tell people you're a widow fleeing southern barbarity, and I'll die a martyr. The good man murdered by his abolitionist wife. My son will inherit everything. The bank will survive. My legacy will be secure. Eleanor absorbed this, the full scope of Charles's manipulation becoming clear. He was orchestrating his own posthumous vindication, using her as the villain in a story he was writing with his own death. "What about them?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth, Benjamin, what happens to them in your scenario?" "They stay property," Charles said. "My son will inherit them along with everything else. He'll work them until they die. Their literacy, their education, all those dangerous ideas you filled their heads with, it all dies with them. That's justice, Eleanor. They tried to rise above their station, and they'll be punished for it by living the rest of their lives knowing it was all for nothing." Eleanor stood up slowly, the jar still in her hand. She looked at this man she had married, this dying banker trying to weaponize his own mortality, and felt something cold and clear crystallize inside her. "No," she said simply. Charles frowned. "No, I'm not running, and I'm not letting you win." Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the garden, at the carriage house barely visible in the darkness. "You want to make me the villain in your story? Fine. But I'm going to write my own ending. Eleanor, if you don't run, you'll hang—" "Then I hang," she interrupted, "but not before I tell the truth, all of it. The literacy lessons, yes. But also your dying blood, Ruth's poison, your mistress's pregnancy, the failing bank, the collapsing loans. I'll tell them everything, Charles. I'll burn your legacy to ash before I let you use my neck to preserve it." Charles's face had gone grey. "You wouldn't. The scandal would destroy you too." "I'm already destroyed," Eleanor said. "We both are. The difference is, I'm willing to admit it. To stop pretending this civilization deserves to be preserved. To expose it for exactly what it is, a moral atrocity held together by violence and lies." "If you do this," Charles said, his voice shaking now, "the 5 of them die. My son will make sure of it. He'll sell them to the worst plantations in Louisiana out of pure spite. Is that what you want?" Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but her voice remained steady. "I want them to know they mattered. I want their education preserved. I want someone to remember that 5 people fought to become more than what this society allowed. Even if they die, even if I die, that story needs to exist. That's worth more than my life or your legacy." Charles slumped in his chair, defeated. "You're insane." "Maybe," Eleanor agreed. "Or maybe I'm finally sane after 7 years of pretending to be something I'm not." She left him there, blind and dying and raging impotently in his study. She walked through the sleeping house, past the servants' quarters, where 43 people lay dreaming of freedom, or trying not to dream at all. She returned to the carriage house and spent the hours before dawn doing something she should have done months ago. She documented everything. Using the charcoal from the walls, she wrote her testimony directly onto the brick. She recorded the names of her 5 students, what she had taught them, what they had learned. She copied passages from the books they had studied. Mathematical equations Marcus had solved, poems Thomas had memorized, remedies Ruth had shared, questions Benjamin had asked. She wrote about her motivations, her guilt, her desperate attempt to do something good in a world built on evil. She wrote about Charles's blackmail, his dying blood, his manipulation. She wrote about Ruth's poison, delivered unknowingly through Eleanor's own hands. She wrote about the impossible choices facing anyone who tried to resist slavery, how every act of kindness became complicity, how every attempt to help caused harm, how the system corrupted everything it touched. And she wrote the truth that would doom her but preserve them. These 5 people are not property. They are scholars, thinkers, human beings with minds as sharp and souls as rich as anyone who has ever lived. If you read this and still believe slavery is justified, then you are choosing willful blindness. The truth is here, written on these walls. 5 names, 5 lives, 5 people who mattered. By the time the sun rose, every surface in the carriage house was covered in her testimony. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all transformed into a record that could never be entirely erased. Eleanor stood in the center of it all, exhausted and strangely at peace. She had chosen her ending. Now she just had to see it through. She walked to the main house as the servants were beginning their morning tasks. She found Thomas in the garden, Sarah in the kitchen, Marcus in the stable, Ruth in her herb room, Benjamin winding the grandfather clock. She spoke to each of them briefly, privately, saying goodbye without saying goodbye. "The carriage house," she told Thomas. "Go there tonight after I'm gone. Read the walls. Remember what we did. Find a way to tell someone someday that this happened, that we existed." Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll remember." She gave the same message to each of them, watching their faces as they understood what she was planning. They didn't argue. They didn't try to stop her. They simply held her hands, squeezed tight, and let go. Then Eleanor went to the police station and confessed to murdering her husband. Detective Mercier stared at her across his desk, his expression skeptical. "Mrs. Beaumont, your husband isn't dead yet." "He will be," Eleanor said calmly. "Within days, and I'm responsible. I taught 5 of my slaves to read and write, which is illegal. When my husband discovered this, he threatened to sell them, so I poisoned him, slowly, using compounds provided by one of the slaves, Ruth. I've been administering the poison for 3 months. He's dying now. I want to confess before he does." This is... Mercier struggled for words. "Mrs. Beaumont, do you understand what you're saying? Confessing to this means you'll be hanged." "I understand. And you're implicating this woman, Ruth. She'll be executed too, publicly, probably burned alive. That's what Louisiana does to slaves who murder white people." Eleanor felt her composure crack for the first time. "Ruth is innocent. I lied about her involvement. She knows herbs, yes, but she had no idea I was using her knowledge to poison my husband. She's not guilty of anything except surviving in a system that treats her as property." "That's not how the law will see it," Mercier said flatly. "If you testify that she provided the poison, she dies. That's justice." "That's not justice," Eleanor said quietly. "That's just more violence. But I understand I can't stop it. I can only tell the truth and hope someone, someday, understands what I was trying to do." The arrest was swift and public. Eleanor was taken from the police station in chains, paraded through the streets of New Orleans as crowds gathered to watch. Women she had taken tea with screamed obscenities. Men she had dined with spat at her feet. The news spread through the city like fire. The banker's wife had confessed to murder and sedition, both. She had been teaching slaves to read. She had poisoned her own husband. She was everything wrong with women who got ideas above their station. Charles died 3 days later, his death transformed by public narrative into martyrdom. He became the good man destroyed by his wife's dangerous sympathies, the victim of female hysteria combined with abolitionist corruption. Ruth was arrested immediately. She denied everything, insisted she had no knowledge of any poison, that Eleanor had acted alone. But Louisiana law didn't require her guilt to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The word of a dying white man, Charles's deathbed testimony that Ruth had provided the compounds, was sufficient for conviction. The trial was brief and predetermined. Eleanor confessed. Ruth professed innocence, but was convicted anyway based on Eleanor's original testimony. The judge sentenced them both to death. Eleanor by hanging, as befitted a white woman of quality. Ruth by burning, as befitted a slave who had murdered her master. The executions were scheduled 3 weeks apart to maximize public attendance and moral instruction. Eleanor spent her final weeks in a cell that smelled of mold and human waste. The walls wept moisture in the Louisiana heat. Rats skittered in the corners. The only light came from a small window set high in the wall, too small to escape through but large enough to mark the passing of days. She received no visitors. Charles's family had disowned her entirely. Her own family in Charleston had sent a letter declaring she was dead to them, that her name would never be spoken again. The women who had once attended her parties now wrote editorials about the dangers of educating women, of allowing them too much independence, of the inevitable moral decay that followed when females were permitted to think. But on the 5th day of her imprisonment, someone did come. Father Benedict from St. Louis Cathedral appeared at her cell door, holding a Bible and wearing an expression of such profound sadness that Eleanor almost pitied him. "I heard your confession," he said quietly, settling on the wooden stool that was the cell's only furniture. "That day you came to the church. You told me what you were doing, teaching them to read, trying to give them something beyond survival. You knew," Eleanor said. "And you said nothing. I'm bound by the seal of confession. I couldn't speak even if I wanted to, but I've been thinking about what you told me, about the burden of knowing and doing nothing. You said you were drowning in complicity, that every day you did nothing made you more guilty. I told you to pray for guidance, to trust in God's plan, and you looked at me like I had failed you, which I had. Why are you here, Father?" Benedict set the Bible aside. "To tell you that what you did mattered. To tell you that I've spent every night since your arrest praying for the courage to do what you did, to risk something for what's right, and to ask if there's anything I can do to help them. Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth, Benjamin, the ones you were trying to save." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes for the first time since her arrest. "Buy them. Use the church's money. Charles's son will sell them cheap now because they're tainted by association with me. Buy them and send them north. There are networks, Quakers in Philadelphia, abolitionists in Boston. They can help." "I'll try," Benedict promised. "I can't guarantee success, but I'll try, and I'll make sure your testimony is preserved. The Carriage house, I've seen it. The walls covered in your writing, I'll document it, photograph it before they destroy it. So even if you're erased from history, the truth will exist somewhere." "Thank you," Eleanor whispered. Benedict stood to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Beaumont, Eleanor, are you at peace with what's coming?" Eleanor considered the question. Was she at peace? She was about to die for crimes that weren't quite what everyone thought they were. She had confessed to murder, to protect people who would probably be destroyed anyway. She had sacrificed herself on the altar of principle without any guarantee that it mattered. "No," she said honestly. "I'm terrified. I'm angry. I'm grieving everything I'm losing, but I'm not sorry. Does that count as peace?" Benedict smiled sadly. "It's closer than most of us get." He left her then, and Eleanor returned to her contemplation of the ceiling, the walls, the small square of sky visible through the high window. 3 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Eleanor marked time by the changing quality of light, by the rhythm of guards delivering her meager meals, by the sounds of the city beyond her cell, market bells, carriage wheels, the cries of street vendors, the whole ordinary machinery of life continuing without her. She thought often about her 5 students. Were they surviving? Had Charles's son sold them yet, or was he keeping them close to maximize their suffering? Had they gone to the Carriage house and read her testimony? Did they understand what she had tried to do? She would never know. That was the hardest part, dying without knowing if any of it had mattered, if her sacrifice had accomplished anything beyond satisfying her own need to feel like she had fought back. On the morning of her execution, Eleanor was given a dress to wear. Simple grey cotton, not the elaborate gowns she had worn in her previous life. They brought her water to wash, a comb for her hair, small mercies designed to make her look presentable for the public spectacle of her death. She was loaded into a cart and driven through the streets of New Orleans toward the square where the gallows had been erected. Crowds lined the route, thousands of people turning out to witness justice being done. Some threw refuse, others simply stared with the same morbid curiosity that drew people to any public execution. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. The gallows loomed ahead, a wooden platform with a trapdoor and a noose. The sight of it made Eleanor's legs weak, but she forced herself to climb the steps steadily. She would not stumble. She would not beg. She would not give them that. The executioner waited with the noose in his hands. Behind him, a priest prepared to offer last rites. In front of the platform, a crowd of hundreds pressed close, eager for the moment of death. The judge who had sentenced her read the charges aloud: murder, sedition, corruption of property, conspiracy. Each word carefully chosen to transform her from person to symbol, from Eleanor Beaumont to simply the murderess, the conspirator, the danger. "Have you any last words?" the judge asked, his voice carrying across the square. Eleanor looked out at the faces in the crowd. She saw hatred, satisfaction, righteousness, fear. She saw the entire architecture of Southern civilization assembled to witness her punishment and feel vindicated. "I'm guilty of teaching 5 human beings that they were human," Eleanor said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm guilty of treating people as people instead of property. I'm guilty of believing that literacy is a right, not a privilege reserved for those with light skin. I'm guilty of loving people this society says I should have hated. And I'm guilty of trying, in my small and insufficient way, to resist an evil so enormous that most of you can't even see it anymore. If those are crimes, then I die guilty. But history will remember which side was right." The crowd roared with outrage at her defiance. The executioner moved to place the noose around her neck. In that final moment, Eleanor looked past the crowd, toward the direction of St. Charles Avenue, toward the mansion and the garden and the carriage house, where 5 names were carved into the walls. She thought of Thomas, reading by lamplight, Sarah finding something to hope for, Marcus whispering equations, Ruth sharing wisdom older than America, Benjamin asking his endless questions. She hoped they were alive. She hoped they were free. She hoped someone, someday, would read her testimony and understand. The noose settled around her neck, rough hemp against her skin. The priest murmured prayers she couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. The executioner checked the mechanism one final time. "Eleanor Beaumont," the judge intoned, "may God have mercy on your soul." The trapdoor opened. Eleanor fell. And in that endless moment between falling and stopping, she felt not fear, but something like relief. She had chosen. She had acted. She had refused to be complicit. And whatever came next, oblivion or judgment or something beyond imagining, she would face it knowing she had tried. The rope snapped taut. Eleanor Beaumont died at 10:47 a.m. on August 15, 1857. She was 31 years old. 3 days later, they burned Ruth in the same square, and the smell of smoke hung over New Orleans for a week. The story should have ended there. Eleanor dead, Ruth dead, Charles dead, the Beaumont estate dissolved. The 5 students sold away to separate plantations, scattered across Louisiana and Mississippi, their education and their hope buried with their teacher. That's how these stories usually ended in 1857. Resistance crushed, participants destroyed, evidence erased. The system grinding on, inevitable as gravity. But something strange happened after Eleanor's execution. The carriage house became haunted. Oh, not haunted in any supernatural sense, though that's what locals claimed. No, it was haunted by something far more dangerous than ghosts. It was haunted by truth. Father Benedict had kept his promise. Before Charles's son could order the carriage house destroyed, Benedict had hired a photographer to document the walls. Every surface covered in Eleanor's testimony, every name, every equation, every fragment of the curriculum she had taught. The photographer created dozens of plates, capturing the evidence in permanent form. Benedict sent copies to abolition societies in the North. Within months, Eleanor's testimony was being reproduced in newspapers from Boston to Chicago. The profane secret of the banker's wife became a rallying cry for abolitionists. Eleanor herself was transformed from criminal to martyr, her story weaponized against the institution she had died resisting. Southern newspapers tried to counter the narrative, painting Eleanor as insane, Ruth as a manipulative witch, the whole affair as evidence that education made women dangerous. But the photographs were damning. You could see Eleanor's handwriting, clear and deliberate. You could read the lessons she had taught, the care she had taken, the humanity she had insisted on recognizing. The story spread beyond America. British abolitionists used it in their campaigns. French newspapers ran sensational accounts. Eleanor Beaumont became internationally famous as the woman who had sacrificed everything to teach 5 slaves their humanity. But what about those 5 students? That's what everyone wanted to know. What happened to Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth's family, Benjamin? The answer was both tragic and miraculous. Charles's son, Robert Beaumont, had indeed planned to sell them to the worst plantations he could find. But Father Benedict had intervened, offering to purchase all 5. Robert, eager to rid himself of anything associated with the scandal, had agreed. Benedict had then done something technically illegal, but morally imperative. He had immediately manumitted them, granting legal freedom. He had also provided them with false papers, identifying them as free blacks who had purchased their own freedom years earlier, and funds to escape north. Thomas made it to Philadelphia, where he joined the Underground Railroad and spent the next 4 years helping other escaped slaves reach freedom. When the Civil War began, he enlisted in the Union Army with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first black regiments. He survived the war, became a teacher in the Freedmen's Bureau, and lived to see slavery abolished. He died in 1892, leaving behind a memoir that included detailed accounts of Eleanor's lessons and Ruth's execution. Sarah fled to Canada, settling in a small community of escaped slaves in Ontario. She married a blacksmith, had 3 more children who survived to adulthood, and worked as a midwife for 30 years. In her old age, she told stories about Miss Eleanor to her grandchildren, keeping the memory alive for generations. Marcus made it only as far as Kentucky before being captured by slave catchers. He was sold to a cotton plantation where he lasted 6 months before dying of pneumonia. He was 20 years old. But before he died, he taught 2 other young slaves basic arithmetic, passing on what Eleanor had given him. Benjamin, the youngest, was adopted by a Quaker family in Pennsylvania. They sent him to school, where his aptitude for mechanics flourished. He became a watchmaker, then an engineer, designing water systems for growing cities. He never forgot Eleanor or Ruth. He named his first daughter Eleanor Ruth, and told her every year on her birthday about the woman who had risked everything to teach him. As for Ruth, she had a daughter who had been sold away years earlier. That daughter, Rebecca, learned of her mother's execution through the abolitionist newspapers. She escaped her plantation in 1860 and made it north, where she became a prominent speaker in abolition circles. She spoke about her mother's wisdom, Eleanor's courage, and the 5 of them who had gathered in a carriage house every night to insist on their humanity. The Beaumont mansion was eventually sold, subdivided, demolished. St. Charles Avenue changed, evolved, forgot. But the carriage house remained, too insignificant to be worth destroying but too famous to be entirely erased. It became a landmark, a memorial. Locals called it the House of 5 Shadows, claiming you could hear whispers if you stood near it at night. Some said it was Eleanor's ghost, still teaching lessons. Others claimed it was Ruth, chanting protective spells. A few insisted it was all 5 students reading aloud from books that no longer existed, but the truth was simpler and stranger. The Carriage House whispered because the story refused to die. In 1862, Union troops occupied New Orleans. Among them was Thomas, now a sergeant in the 54th Massachusetts. He requested permission to visit the Beaumont estate, to stand in the carriage house where Eleanor had taught him freedom. The building was still there, abandoned and decaying. Thomas entered with a lantern and found the walls exactly as Eleanor had left them, covered in testimony, names, lessons. 5 years had passed, but the charcoal marks remained. Thomas stood in that space and wept, not just from grief, but from recognition. Eleanor had known she would die. She had known the education would be disrupted, the students scattered, but she had created this, a permanent record that couldn't be sold away, couldn't be silenced, couldn't be erased. She had carved their names into history. Thomas brought other soldiers to see it, black soldiers who had been born into slavery and lived to see it abolished. White soldiers from Massachusetts and New York who had never witnessed slavery firsthand. They read the walls together. These men who would have been enemies 5 years earlier, united by their recognition of the truth Eleanor had inscribed. One of those soldiers was a journalist named William Bradford. He documented the carriage house extensively, interviewed Thomas, and published a long-form article titled The Profane Secret: How 5 Slaves and a Southern Lady Declared War on Slavery. The article was reprinted dozens of times during Reconstruction. Eleanor's testimony was quoted in congressional debates about black education. Frederick Douglass himself referenced her in a speech, calling her a white woman who understood that slavery corrupted everyone it touched and who chose to be corrupted by resistance rather than complicity. But perhaps the most significant legacy came much later. In 1872, 15 years after Eleanor's execution, a school for black children opened in New Orleans. It was called the Beaumont Institute, funded by Northern abolition societies and named explicitly to honor Eleanor's sacrifice. The curriculum emphasized literacy, mathematics, philosophy, all the subjects Eleanor had taught in her secret carriage house. The first teachers at the Beaumont Institute were Benjamin, who traveled from Pennsylvania to help establish the program, and Sarah's eldest daughter, who had inherited her mother's determination. Together, they taught hundreds of formerly enslaved children and grandchildren, passing on knowledge that had once been forbidden. The school operated for 43 years, surviving Reconstruction and the violent backlash that followed. It was eventually burned down by white supremacists in 1915 during the rise of Jim Crow, but by then it had educated over 2,000 students, many of whom became teachers themselves, spreading literacy and resistance across the South. The carriage house stood longer than the school. It survived the Civil War, Reconstruction, the New Orleans flooding of 1897, but it couldn't survive the Mississippi River flood of 1927. On the night of April 27, 1927, the levees broke. Water surged through New Orleans with devastating force, drowning neighborhoods, destroying buildings, remaking the landscape. The Beaumont carriage house, already weakened by 70 years of neglect, was swept away entirely. Locals said you could hear screaming as it collapsed, though whether it was the sound of wood splintering or something more, no one could say for certain. When the waters receded, nothing remained except the foundation and scattered bricks. The walls that had held Eleanor's testimony were gone, washed away into the Mississippi and out to the Gulf of Mexico. But by then, it didn't matter. The story had already escaped. Eleanor's testimony had been photographed, reprinted, analyzed, discussed. Thomas's memoir had been published. Sarah's descendants kept her story alive. Benjamin's engineering firm had created a plaque commemorating the 5 students and their teacher. Rebecca's speeches had been recorded and archived. The physical structure was gone, but the truth it contained had multiplied beyond anyone's ability to contain or destroy it. History did remember which side was right, not immediately, not easily, not without tremendous cost and continued resistance. But eventually, undeniably, the truth Eleanor had insisted on recognizing became impossible to deny. Slavery was abolished. Black Americans gained the right to vote, to own property, to testify in court, to attend school. The system that had seemed eternal and inevitable in 1857 crumbled, revealed as exactly what Eleanor had called it, an evil so enormous that only willful blindness could sustain it. And somewhere in all that change, in all that painful progress, 5 names persisted, not as prominently as they deserved, not with the recognition they had earned, but persisted nonetheless. Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth, Benjamin, and Eleanor Beaumont, who had taught them that their humanity was not contingent on anyone's permission to recognize it. The Beaumont estate was eventually redeveloped into apartments in the 1960s. The garden where Eleanor had walked was paved over for parking. The main house was subdivided into small units. Nothing remained of the grandeur that had once signified Charles Beaumont's wealth and power. But the foundation of the Carriage house remained visible, protected now by the New Orleans Historical Society. A small marker explained its significance. Site of the House of 5 Shadows, where Eleanor Beaumont conducted secret literacy lessons for enslaved persons, 1856-1857. Beaumont and Ruth were executed for their resistance. 5 students achieved freedom during the Civil War. Their names: Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Benjamin, and Ruth's descendants. Remember them. Tourists sometimes visit. History students studying abolition and resistance. Descendants of the 5 trying to connect with their ancestors' courage. People who hear whispers and want to understand what they're really hearing. Not ghosts, but the echo of a truth that refused to be silenced. On certain nights when the river is high and the air is thick with humidity, locals still claim you can hear something near that foundation. A woman's voice, they say, counting, teaching, insisting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 names, 5 lives that mattered, 5 people who learned they were human and died knowing it was true. That was Eleanor Beaumont's profane secret. Not witchcraft or poison or forbidden rituals, just the simple, revolutionary, dangerous truth. Everyone is human, and humanity cannot be owned. She died for that truth in 1857. And 70 years later, when the floodwaters finally erased the Carriage house, the truth washed away into the Mississippi and became part of the river itself, flowing south to the Gulf, then out to the ocean, then evaporating into the sky, then falling as rain on the very ground where new generations would grow up learning that Eleanor's profane secret was no secret at all. It was just the truth, obvious, undeniable. Worth dying for. 5 names carved into history: Thomas, Sarah, Marcus, Ruth, Benjamin, remember them, and Eleanor Beaumont, who believed they were worth remembering.